It isn't credible to me because which international civilian vessel is going to put ships in and out of Odessa port when there are missiles? And it's important to remember, of course, relatively imprecise missiles, because Russia is running short of its most precise, accurate sort, when those are attacking the port itself. Nobody knows if your ship is in the wrong part of the harbour or your sailors are in the wrong area, they'll get killed. Which insurance company is going to cover those kind of risks? Russia knows what it's doing. It has signed this agreement, but it is now creating conditions very fast in which it will be basically impossible to deliver the intent or the effect of that agreement.
Yeah. Is this very much its modus operandi since it began this invasion, you know, saying one thing but undermining it the very next minute?
I would say so. We can't trust what Russian officials say, and that's not just because they're dishonest, although many of them patently are. It's because many of them are not in the loop. So, for example, we saw Sergei Lavrov repeatedly say before the invasion there was no invasion coming. He was being dishonest, but I think it was equally true that he wasn't in the loop. He wasn't in the inner circle of decision-making in the Kremlin. And so this is what happens. Russia sends its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, its diplomats out to make these kind of deals. And it's not that it says to them necessarily dissemble and lie. I think in many cases it simply doesn't tell them the truth itself. And so you have diplomats who are buying Russia space, buying Russia time. And of course, this week we have Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, visiting many of the African countries that are most affected by the grain crisis. And therefore there is a Russian diplomatic incentive to make it look as though it is resolving this food crisis, while the military, who of course conduct the war on their own terms, dictated by the Kremlin, are pursuing these kind of strategies regardless of what the diplomats are saying or doing.
Yeah, which makes it absurd, but also incredibly difficult as Ukraine is desperate and the rest of the world is desperate for these grain exports to get moving. Shashank, let's look at Ukraine too. Now, talking about timing, they want to try and gain as much ground back before winter. They're talking about regaining Kherson by August. Is that plausible?
It depends what you mean. Kherson is a city. It's also a province, quite a big province, that is currently predominantly occupied by Russia and has been since February. And so if you talk about restoring control of the entirety of the province, if you look at a map and you'll see the size of this thing, the scale of the front lines involved, I would say I am in some doubt as to whether that kind of operation could be completed within a month. It is true that we are seeing the beginnings of counterattacks in Kherson, not necessarily a full-scale counteroffensive. This may or may not be the beginning of that counteroffensive, but Ukraine also has a number of deficiencies, both in terms of the amount of firepower it has, still fairly limited, the number of trained forces it has. It only has about 5 brigades doing the lion's share of fighting, and so that's not very much. And in other things like armored personnel carriers, UAVs to spot targets, electronic warfare equipment. Ukraine is also in a position where it's defending reasonably well, but to go on the offense on a large scale is very demanding in terms of casualties, equipment, ammunition, and all of those things. And so I'm very cautious about what I'm expecting to see from Ukraine. It is entirely plausible we won't see a bigger offensive until later in the year. This may be just the sort of beginning or feints to try and draw Russia out of position, what we're seeing this week.
Yeah, and that's important too, as Russia now talks about broadening its ambitions beyond the east of the country.
Yeah, Russia's talking about that openly, but of course, you know, let's be very clear. Russia's strategic aim at the beginning of this war was to subjugate Ukraine and conquer Kyiv, and it failed. And it focused its attention to Donbass in the east, but it still occupied most of the south. We had Russian generals talking about establishing control of the south all the way to Transnistria, in other words, all the way along Ukraine's southern coastline of the Black Sea. They already control the Sea of Azov coastline. And so what they say, I wouldn't pay too much attention to it. The fact is there are short-term Russian aims and there are long-term Russian aims. And the long-term Russian aims haven't changed. And I would say if Russia succeeds in the east and in the south, which is looking unlikely at present, it will rebuild its armed forces and it will very likely have another attempt on Kyiv. It hasn't given up on those long-term aspirations. That's the way I would see it. Whatever they say, whatever these regular statements are, those are to be taken as kind of statements of public diplomacy rather than serious strategy.
Yeah, and I know that you are such a student and analyst of these things. I wonder how you see this conflict bedding in. How do you see it continuing to play out? It's obviously clear there's not going to be any quick resolution.
No, I think we're in for a long conflict that will stretch into next year, although it will have periods of calm. In a sense, we are already in a lull because Russia's force has been so depleted by the costly offensive it made on Severodonetsk, which it, of course, took after over a month and many, many casualties. But I don't think Russia's army has enough force in it now to push further along in Donbass, to take the rest of Donetsk province, to take Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, these big urban centers that are very well defended by the Ukrainians. And I think that as they sort of get stretched and depleted, they'll have to decide, do we focus on more offensive action in Donbass, or do we shore up our lines that are becoming stretched and attacked in Kherson, where the Ukrainians this week are blowing up bridges around the city? I think we may see some serious setbacks for the Russians in the south. But look, we have to be very humble about this. Nobody knows. We don't fully understand the inner strength of the Ukrainians or how ready they are. There's lots of unknowns in this. But I think the Russian armed forces are looking like a pretty spent force to me. And the only question that arises, the big one for me, is, do the Ukrainians have enough in them to exploit that moment of weakness of the Russians and really take back a lot of ground in Kherson, either this week or over the next several months? Because if they don't, I think it will put them in a very difficult position with their Western allies, who will say, we can support you, we will back you, but if you're not able to take ground back, it's time you have to think about ceasefires. And that's the political predicament Ukraine is in. Yeah, that sort of total game. I mean, you're talking about casualties and how damaged Russia is. The CIA has estimated around 15,000 Russians have been killed. Do you think that assessment is close? I think that's probably the lower bound. I've heard British officials talk about 25,000 killed. Ukrainian ones talk about 38,000 killed, which seems very high to me. The one thing I'd really impress upon viewers is to say that 15,000 killed is not the big statistic, because in war, it doesn't matter how many you've had killed. It matters how many you have killed and wounded. And historically, the ratio that armies tend to have is 3 to 1. 3 people wounded for every 1 killed. Now, in America's army, in Western armies, it's a much bigger ratio because we have better medical care. Russia's army has worse medical care, and artillery tends to wound much more than other weapons as well. So if the Russians are operating at, say, 1 to 3 or sort of 1 to 4, 15,000 casualties killed means 60,000 casualties. 25,000 killed at a 4 to 1 ratio means 100,000, more than 100,000, 125,000 casualties. These are enormous casualties for the Russian force to be taking. So I think that's the really key problem for them. They just don't have the manpower for this unless they mobilize the Russian society, and Vladimir Putin is not yet willing to do that. Yeah, very interesting. Good to get your perspective. Thank you so much, as always, Shashank. You're very welcome.